So we have described already the late Bronze Age, the Amarna period, and then the period of decline in the Iron One until the late 10th century. And then even later, in the beginning of the 9th century, I don't see a reason to think about a big change in Jerusalem. The first transformation of Jerusalem takes place, in my opinion, in the second half of the 9th century. Now, please remember that when I give you dates here, starting 10 years ago, my dates are all radiocarbon. My chronology is radiocarbon influenced, which means when I tell you second half of the 9th century, it means that I have evidence from radiocarbon to date certain assemblages of pottery to the late 9th century, and when I see them in the ground, I know that I am in the late 9th century BC. We are speaking radiocarbon here. I mean, today in modern archaeology, there's no way to continue with mumbo-jumbo of chronology, you know, throwing centuries here and centuries there without, you know, putting order to this chaotic situation with the very powerful tool of radiocarbon studies. And I think that today we can really establish a good skeleton for the entire Iron Age by deploying the hundreds of samples, radiocarbon dated samples that come from many sites in Israel. So, having described the background of dating, radiocarbon dating, we can turn now to the finds on the ground in Jerusalem. And indeed, in the second half of the 9th century, in a phase that we call the late Iron 2A, we have the first evidence that something is going on in Jerusalem. It's not like before. There is more evidence in the sense of pottery, in the sense of finds, in the sense also of architecture. Let me give you two examples. In the place which is described as the Palace of King David, in the city of David. I don't think that this is the Palace of King David. I think that it's much more complicated than that. But some of the walls there may date to the late Iron 2A, and these walls are relatively monumental. So some sort of building activity more meaningful than before was carried out in Jerusalem in the second half of the 9th century, let's say close to the year 800 BC. The second piece of evidence comes from the excavations near the Gihon Spring, where Reich and Shukrun found seals with the art representations, different art representations, no inscriptions on them. Later we do have bulle also with inscriptions starting or seal impressions with inscriptions starting in the late 8th century BC and more so in the 7th century BC. But even though there are no inscriptions on the bulle from the city of David, the date of this group of about 200 bulle from the excavations is around 800 BC, I suppose. Maybe a few years before, maybe a few years later. If one says to me, well, it's from 780, I cannot resist. Okay, fine. This is also a possibility. But the most important point is that they testify for some sort of administration in Jerusalem at that time that is not evident in the period before. So we have reasons to say that this is the first step forward of Jerusalem back to prosperity from the very long period of decline. Okay, starting in the Middle Bronze Age in the 15th century, 16th century BC, in the late 9th century, which means, 600 years later, okay, or so, you have the first evidence that Jerusalem is moving up again towards the